to welcome you to today's PACE seminar on education technology policy, and welcome those of you who are new to PACE. This is some of you I know are coming for the first time, and so welcome. Our speaker today is Dr. Charles Kerchner, who is a professor emeritus at the Claremont Graduate University in Southern California, and who over the years has taught me quite a lot about technology policy, and in recent years we've begun to think together about technology policy, and I'm really looking forward to Chuck's presentation. I think you all will learn a lot. So, Dr. Kerchner, thank you.
Greetings, enjoy your lunch. The title of this little ditty is Education Technology Policy for a 21st Century Learning System. And I wanted to, at the outset, underscore the second part of the title. What I'm going to talk about is not buying iPads and sprinkling water on them. It is, in fact, about how do we think about how we change the system of learning that we offer for students and make available. And let me just say, as long as we're sort of in the beginning slide parenthesis, I've written a good bit about this that I'm not going to talk about today. A lot of my postings and little bits are up on the website, www.mindworkers.com. I'd be very happy to have you take a look at that stuff and engage me however you would like to do it based on what you've read there. So let's start with the problem. The problem is that education technology has always overpromised and underperformed. Several years ago I was in the office and we needed to clean out a storeroom because we needed the space for something. And I was, they were shelves like this, and they had old journals on them like that. And I reached up and I pulled down one that promised that this new technology would revolutionize education. It would make education more personal. It would engage students. It would make students learn more. It would make work easier and more productive for teachers. And the journal was published in 1923, and the technology was a student workbook. Now, from that time to this, we have fallen into this historical trap that there is no more efficient system that we've created than one that puts 30 kids in a classroom with a teacher, unless it's to add a few more kids. Hence the discussions at bargaining time over class size. But buying technology is a good thing for schools. Schools like to buy technology. It makes them look modern and progressive. States like to buy technology because it makes them look modern and progressive. But the new technology is almost always crammed into this old learning production system. So if we're going to talk about fundamentally changing the learning production system, we then need to start to talk about what the policy looks like. Because historically we've had this kind of a situation where education innovation has not at all been equal to the pace of technological innovation. You get the technology, but you don't get the innovation. Until now, because what we think we have going on now is that the internet has the capacity to change learning and the learning production system in three important ways. One, it allows us to move from a batch processing system, which we created circa 1910, to a much more individualized system. Second, we actually do have software that can make you smarter. That is, there are things in the software feedback loop that will make teachers smarter, that will make kids smarter, and arguably will make school systems smarter. And I'll follow up on that in question time if you want to ask me questions about that. But the biggest single thing that happens as a function of modern internet-driven technology is we've got the capacity to move from what is functionally a hierarchical system, the one that we know and love, into a system that's fundamentally built on network thinking and network technology. Why is this thing changing on its own? Well, then the policy problem is, the policy problem is that technology is going to grow regardless. It doesn't make any difference what we do in this room or what they do in the big building down their block. There's tons of technology change that are going to take place. And I don't think that Governor Brown in his first administration or Ronald Reagan in his administration really spent an awful lot of time talking about how we were going to phase in this new thing called personal computers. It happened anyway. And so there are thousands of people working on apps and clouds and so forth, and we have almost no public policy control over the speed at which they work. It's also hard to link technology with investments. We are pushed very hard by our political constituents to say, can't we just grow back up this system the same way it used to be? We got a little money now. Couldn't we just add back in the nurses? Can't we have a librarian in my school again? How about class size? And so we're going to face a doggedly difficult public policy problem trying to find a way to carve out room for thinking about learning differently and buying the things we need to buy in order to do that. And to make it more difficult, anything that changes the way in which people learn or the things they are supposed to learn is somehow dismissed a bit as being cool but way too controversial to bring up here to the big place to worry about. So we've got a difficult problem, but the state also has an important interest in how technology gets used. Do you get a little tired of the fact that you pick up Education Week or any other thing, and California appears at the bottom of the league tables? I mean, is that a little embarrassing? It's important both for the state's image, for its economic development, that California lead rather than lag. It's important that we do it in a smart and sensible way, and that we gain the capacity to create a technologically fueled education system. It's important that the state create an efficient education system. There's something about that in the Constitution. It's important that we create access and equity. And it's important that we create an open system and prevent capture by vendors. Let me elaborate on this last point. We have moved from a situation in which we have lots of people selling textbooks to a situation in which we have a few people selling learning systems. In effect, we have outsourced the intellectual and pedagogical core of our education system into as a make or buy decision. I think that's wrong, and I think we have the opportunity to turn that around if we get our technology policy right. So I'm going to be a little evangelical on this point, but we'll come back there later if you wish. So this is my big question. Why should California, the headwater of the digital revolution, get stuck in the eddies of early 20th century school design? I can't think of a good reason why we should do that. Do you? So I want to talk a little bit about 3 technology policies. 1, invest where schools have persistent and expensive problems. English language learners, special ed, remediation, the transition between high school and higher education. 2, I want to create an educational infrastructure for teachers and students and schools so that people can learn differently. And 3rd, I want to modify some regulations. I'm going to take these in this order, with the regulations last because everybody else starts talking about deregulation first. And so there's lots of stuff out there to talk about regulation. So policy one, tackle the persistent and expensive problems. Now I'm talking to the choir here, you probably already know all this stuff, but look at the budget allocation within the Los Angeles Unified School District. In 1967, about 85% of the operating budget, found its way into classrooms. Now that number, into regular classroom, regular instruction. Now that number is down in the 40s. Special education and a raft of categoricals have ramped up in the meantime. So we have created a system in which the core of the system itself is A, absorbing less money, and B, is essentially disenabled from doing its work. Here's the state line for the same thing. Little blue line going up on per pupil funding increases. Big red line going up in terms of percentage increase in categorical funding. So let's do the numbers. English language learners cost us about $1.4 billion. Remediation, according to one estimate, about $274 million a year. Special ed, about $9.3 billion. We don't know what the transition to college costs because I can't figure it out, but it's a fairly large number. Now let's make some sort of back of the envelope calculations. Let's suppose that we were able to save 10% in terms of making ELL either more efficient or less necessary. That looks like $196 million to me. Let's suppose that we could cut down the amount of remediation that we needed by 1/3, thus making everyone happy. That sounds like about $100 million. And let's suppose we could do with technology functionally, we could deal with technology functionally in order to add a week of instruction in special ed classrooms a year. So it's looking like $290 million, and I threw in another $50 million because it's got to be there someplace in the transition to college. So I come up with my funny number of $636 million. Now, you don't have to believe this number. It's a back of the envelope calculation. You know that, and I know that. But the point is, it's a big number. If it's only half that number, it's still a big number. If it's a quarter of that number, it's still a big number. It's a target that we should go after, and we should go after it now. Here's my idea about picking on the low overhanging fruit. Let's think about some social media technology for special educators. Let's make good work of adaptive software. The adaptive software is coming down the pike so fast that it's very, very difficult to keep up with. And that's going to be one of the questions for, I want to go back here. This thing turned on automatic page turn. I'm not quite sure why it's doing it. I think it wants me to be done. Would you like me to be done? We can all go out. Adaptive software is an important element that we can talk about. And the third thing is classroom and learning management systems. Now, these are we've got lots of field trials in things like Moodle, which I happen to like because it's open source software. But even the existing program of Moodle has some real drawbacks, and the folks are working on that. We need to be able to get software that tells a kid how he or she is doing, and tells the kid's parents how a kid is doing. And it needs to be real-time kind of information, not when you get your state report card at the end of the summer. So let me dive down into just one of these things, and in part I'm doing a shout out to some people in a little organization just because I like them, and another I just want to use this as a simple illustration. over on Page Mill Road in Palo Alto, there's some guys working in about 3 cubicles. One is a guy named Daniel Yu, and he used to be a special ed teacher, and he got frustrated the special ed teachers spent an awful lot of their time shuffling paper. And he said, I think I know how to fix this system. So he's created this little company with his friends called Goldbook. And Goldbook takes the basic logic of Facebook and turns it into an educational tool. So you, and you know, you're a speech therapist, and you're an assistant principal, and you're the principal, and you're the parent, and you're the regular classroom teacher, and you're the reading teacher, and we've all got this one student in common, and his name is Michael. Well, in Goldbook, we can form a group. We can share stuff that's just all about Michael. We can get Michael's results. If Michael does something really nice in my classroom, I take out one of these, I take a picture, 2 seconds later it is on your account. So you can get comprehensive student profiles, you can get full team collaboration, and you can get the thing that drives the expenses of special ed up. You can get documentation of effort, so that if a child was entitled to something, you can show that the child got it without sending a minivan of people out from the Coordinated Compliance Review Center to check all the paper records that they're required to keep. Daniel maintains that at a minimum, you could get a week's worth of teaching out of teachers that instead of paper hanging out of a year. I don't know whether Daniel's right, but what I do think is we ought to give Daniel a good clinical trial of whether this thing works or not. And hence my first policy notion. We need to think about a different adoption channel for technology. Technology, like textbooks, goes through this very narrow funnel. And as a consequence, it gets legalized and it gets slow. I will almost guarantee you that by the time you get a piece of technology through that funnel, it will be outdated. It also has a remarkable dampening effect on real experimentation. So my idea is fairly simple. Let's start a teacher technology fund in California. Let's make small grants. You pick the number, $500, $2,000, $2,500, pick a number you like and can afford. Let's make them available easily to teachers. You know, one-page online application. Let's get the money to teachers, not to school districts. Let's get the money to teachers. Give them a charge account, like one at Amazon. Maybe you use Amazon, I don't know. So they can buy stuff. And here's what we require of them. We require of them to give us full testimony about how it went, so each one of those teachers is in fact a beta test site. You get good feedback from thousands of people who have tried something new. I think that would be a pretty good investment. And I would couple it with another investment. We've got some good field trials of fairly large systems in personnel and instruction, in data management, going on in school districts in California. It's already out there. We have not been able to aggregate the things that they know in these places, and I would suggest a very large grant to PACE to be able to take that, to PACE or anybody else, but particularly to PACE, to do that. But my plea is really simple here. Start now, do it fast. If a state agency can't do it, you know, a partnership with somebody else that can get the work done in a hurry. Now, policy 2 is somewhat more difficult. I'd like us to create an education infrastructure in California. It's available. to every kid in the state, every family in the state, every school in the state. I do not think that California needs a virtual school a la Florida or some other states. In point of fact, I think in the terms of development of technology, we're beyond that. We don't actually need to have a single state agency that becomes the virtual school. I don't know, I'm probably stepping on somebody's toes. We don't need one virtual school, but we do need lots of virtual networks. More than one, think plural. And the reason we need that, and I'm going to make my commercial here. David said I can't talk about Learning 2.0, but I'm going to talk about it anyway for about 30 seconds. I've been out trying to understand schools where kids learn differently. And I think I put together some ingredients about what a new version of learning looks like, and it pulls together a bunch of old stuff, really. I think we ought to say that and recognize and build around the fact that it is in fact the students that are the real workers in this system. We cannot make education work better by getting adults to work harder. And at the end of the day, you have to be able to incentivize and motivate a 6-year-old or a 14-year-old, and you just don't have any choices about that. And so we need to find a system that will motivate lots and lots of people who think and act and live in different ways, and that means we need plural rather than one best system. We need to be able to reconnect doing and thinking. When we invented this education system 100 years ago, the proximity between knowing something and being able to do it was pretty short, because most people didn't go to school for a long time. But we've delayed adulthood well into the third decade now, if you're going to go into the professions. We need to have kids being able to do, build, create, and if we want a clever society, as all these smart people tell us, that's one way to it. We need an individual education plan for everybody, not just kids that are in special ed. We know how to do that. And we need to be able to unbundle something that we bundled together a century ago: teaching, testing, and growing up. I mean, the best thing a teacher ever did for me was to get me to grow up, not to do a great lecture. And what's starting to happen in technology is you can get the great lecture from lots of different places, and maybe we ought to rebuild teaching on the notion of having it be much more a coaching function and less a direct instruction function, and that we ought to start to think about how the whole occupation changes. And then finally, we need to get into the curriculum the notion that working with other people, collaboration, and that solving fuzzy, difficult to solve, ambiguous problems is part of, is maybe the 21st century skill that was analogous to industrial discipline in the 20th century. This stuff's important. And so we need an infrastructure that helps get us there. That is a big umbrella for the state. So here's some ideas. Here's what I would like to see this do. One, provide access and information. I've looked at a lot of ways to get technology to kids. The mechanical way that I think I like the best is bring your own. Build a technology system around technology that kids bring to school, then make it possible for kids to buy it. The state has an awful lot of purchasing power and a lot of power to try to drive and tweak the market. It makes a lot more sense to have the kids bring their own device than have one locked up in a supply room, checked out, delivered, and so forth and so on. The second bullet point, sort of a no-brainer: increase access to networks at school, at home. And there are lots of people working on this, and so I didn't bring this down to actual numbers, because there are people who have actual numbers that are going to wander in to the State House right away and say, we need another 10 million for access. It's a constant problem because the amount of bandwidth that we need goes up as the toys get better. And then finally, and this is where we've been stuck, you know, there's no reason we should be stuck here, but we are. We need to build a fair and useful data system, and both those words are important. The data system really should never be a gotcha for teachers. We need to get beyond that notion that the way we're building this data system is in order to be able to fire teachers. The way we're building this, the reason we're building this data system is in order to make the system more productive. And if you lead with the reason we're going to build this data system is we want to make it easier to fire teachers, it's going to be a loser from the get-go. I want this system to be an open system. I'm a big fan of open education resources, and I think we ought to, our infrastructure ought to be that way. And then the third thing is important. Stay with me for a minute here. We need a way, as a state, for kids to take tests and get credit that is independent of seat time. That is the big productivity potential gain in this system. There needs to be a way for kids who need to learn, take longer to learn, or can learn faster, to be able to take a test and get certified as knowing something. Lots of problems here. And those of you who have played with the remedial education stuff know there's a certain gaming that goes on in the system and so forth and so on. Well, there's gaming that goes on in all systems. But we need a system that is capable of external testing and gaining credit. So, he says, here's some design principles. The big design principle is the thing that's up there in the corner of the screen, Legos. You need Legos. You need educational Legos. Because what Legos represent is what in manufacturing is known as flexible specialization. It's a very important design principle that got us away from the assembly line. And indeed, you know, we say we don't manufacture anything in the United States anymore. We manufacture more than we ever did. And we've gotten very, very smart about how we do it. We break down complex processes into modules. In the case of education, lessons. Projects that teachers and students can combine and create customized learning. I mean, in a way, this is what Saul Kahn did, but sort of accidentally. The notion that there are lots of bits and pieces and that teachers and individual learners can be able to customize their own education. And that ought to be our #1 design principle. And our second one ought to be get learning tools in the hands of students. If we can drive this whole system with students as opposed to driving it with adults, I think they're going to move us quicker, faster than we have any idea. I've got a 4-year-old grandson, and his older siblings got Kindle Fires for Christmas, and so his dad dusted off the old one of these, you know, took the phone portion out, loaded it up with some stuff, and gave it to him. He's 4. He's never seen this thing before. He looks at it and he said, "Dad," he says, "this condo we're renting for Christmas, it got Wi-Fi?" He said, "What's the password, Dad?" It took this kid who had never seen this thing before 30 seconds to be able to log on and download music. I mean, you know, if we get these tools in the hands of kids, you know, they will, you know, and trust them, they will do good things for us. And the final design principle is this: experiment. Avoid a rush to judgment. One of the things that we're trying so hard to do because we're afraid of making a mistake. We're afraid somebody's going to come into our office and say, you know, you didn't really pick the right math program. There's a better one. We're afraid of that. But this really needs to be an experiment. We, in terms of education technology, you know, are sort of where Hewlett and Packard were when they were still in the garage. It's very early in the game, and we do not want to screw this thing down to the floor and tell people we know how to do this, because we don't. And so we need to have a field that's open for lots of experimentation. And so here's my second public policy idea. And you all can help me with this, because I haven't thought it through. But one of the things I realize is that most of the public policy instruments that we have, regulation, mandates, categorical programs, the stuff that we grew up knowing how to do and how to manage, are probably not going to work for the task of building us an educational infrastructure. And I was toying about what to do with all of this, and about a month ago I was in the United States Capitol and I found a letter that Franklin Roosevelt had written in 1933, and he said, you know, he said, I would like to set up a government corporation that has the flexibility and initiative of a private company. And he called it the Tennessee Valley Authority. The idea was to be able to tame a set of rivers that habitually flooded and caused economic hardship throughout the Middle South. We need something like that. We need some form of public-private partnership that people who are inventive and know how Sacramento works in this room could think about. We need to be able to get the brightest minds in Silicon Valley together with the experienced troops in school districts and say, how can we actually move this thing forward in ways that make sense? To create a specific legislative agenda, to get the right people in the room, and to create this experimenting society that I had talked about earlier. We need to create a clinical trials format, to broker the development of important analytical engines such as those that are used for adaptive software. It turns out this stuff is really hard, and that we don't really have the incentive system there in order to get people working on this hard task. We haven't figured out a way to either put enough philanthropic or government money into it so that the underlying engineering and software work gets done and it gets given away for free, or we haven't figured out a good way to monetize this. So a lot of thinking. And then finally, we need to broker the relationship between users and vendors. So we get vendors doing things that users actually want. There's an awful lot of app making out there, and a lot of it isn't too apt. And so this brings me to my third policy. It's the last slide in the deck, and so you're going to get to ask questions soon. I'm not going to say an awful lot about regulation. There are lots of folks that have written long pieces on regulation, including roadmaps into the California School Code about specifically which sections of which statutes should be changed. And I thought about going down that path, and you know, and my eyes glazed over. I'm sorry, I couldn't do it, and ultimately I thought it was the wrong thing to do. We need to think about regulation very carefully, because each one of those regulations got in there for some purpose. And the people that are writing about deregulating may not understand the purpose that it was there in the first place. But I do have two things, or three things really, that I think that we ought to think about in terms of regulation. One is we need to find some way to get around the seat time versus merit badges notion. It is manifestly unfair to school districts to withdraw average daily attendance because they are charged with the responsibility of custody and care, unless you want custody and care to go someplace else. But we don't have a good social alternative right now. And so we're going to need to be able to compensate school districts for the time that students are there. At the same time, we do need to have some sort of an incentive to get done. And all our incentives are now perverse. And the spillover, in particular, in the breach between elementary and secondary education and higher education, the sort of amount of wasted energy on remediation at both levels is extremely high, and we don't really have a good incentive system that's based on getting things done. Hence, some sort of payment in for achievement. We need to get rid of the contiguous county rule. If we want school districts to be among the engines of innovation, we don't want to move that innovation entirely into the charter and private sector. If we want to say to school districts, that'd be really great if you'd go think of some new stuff and maybe other people could use it too, then we need to get rid of this rule that says, yeah, but only people, and and counties are funny, and some counties have 2 counties that connect with them, and some counties have 15 counties. I mean, it's a silly rule. We ought to get rid of it. And the third thing I would add into the regulatory mix is something that was in this initiative that never made it to the ballot, which is the notion of a California diploma. A student ought to be able to have a certain amount of sway. If a student is able to take a course of study that would get them into the CSU or the UC, even if their school district refuses to offer the courses, they ought to be able to go to, they ought to get a diploma, they ought to be able to go to college. And so, again, we're using students as the vehicle, students as something that school districts would, in this case, value. So that's it. Policy recommendation number 1. Let's think about some small-scale experimentation. Policy recommendation number 2. Let's help and start and build an educational infrastructure for the state. And policy recommendation number 3, let's think about some sort of artful regulation and deregulation. Thank you all very much, and I'd be happy to take your questions.
I have to say, one of the reasons that I really like working with Chuck is that many of you know that when academics start talking, it's often very difficult to get them to stop. And we often run out of time in these seminars, and that was a very concise and a really admirably pointed presentation. On the other hand, there's
actually, David, I'm just following the advice of my wife. He said, Chuck, there's several times when you just could have shut up.
But there's actually sort of a world of content on each of Chuck's slides, so I think there probably are plenty of questions, and I certainly would encourage you to start the conversation. Yeah.
Could you just elaborate a little more on the contiguous county rule? I'm unfamiliar with that.
David, talk about the contiguous county rule.
Oh, thanks. Okay, yes. California has a rule that, and someone probably can explain this better than I, but fundamentally that students can participate in educational programs, but only with a certificated educator, and only if that educator is located either in their own county or in a contiguous county. So if you're in, as Chuck suggested, if you're in LA County, you could work with someone who's in San Bernardino County or Riverside County or 3 or 4 other counties. If you're in Shasta County, you could work with somebody in Trinity County and maybe one other. But you can't have anything to do with somebody who's in Ventura County or San Diego County, even if they have great content that you could really use.
I see.
This is an well, anyway, we won't go into why it's there, but the rule exists, and it's certainly an obstacle to sharing content
So that's tough for
around a big
online
state.
schools.
Yes, it's a very tough online school.
Yeah, it was put in with the idea of dampening down to the low run, pernicious, cheap to run online schools, yeah.
Yeah, Chuck?
So, it's on this seat time versus merit badges, there's a lot of conversations about this
Right.
merit badge thing.
Yeah, you know, so I was fairly clever about sidestepping that. Yeah, I knew there's a third rail in there someplace, I just managed not to touch it. Yeah.
I think back to the transition of liberal arts, NU-driven courses. And that was kind of the same movement, from my perspective. And what concerns me is I believe that there's a foundational set of learning that's required before you allow students just to pick and choose whatever program they want to put together. If you can comment on, is there a foundational set of learning that must occur before merit badges are made available to these students?
That's a really tough notion. I can tell you I'm agnostic about that question. That is, I'm sort of willing to have people talk to me. One of the problems that I see, I'm going to take the con argument first. One of the problems that I see in sort of interesting experimental kinds of, experiential kinds of learning is that the kids that are in schools where their test scores are 50 points below where they should be and are on one of the intervention lists tend not to get any of that because the teachers are making the argument that are making the pro argument, saying, well, I'm sorry, you don't really learn, you don't really know enough yet in order to be able to have one of these engaging experiential kinds of experiences. And it may be possible that we can blend this in a different way. I'm afraid of the way in which the foundational notion then becomes sort of a Hotel California. You know, you really can't check out of this place, so I hear that there. I mean, there are lots of. Let's just take writing as an example. You know, it really helps if you're going to be a writer if you've got some of the fundamentals. Now, it's a term of art, really, about how do you pick that up? Do you learn to write by writing and publishing along the way, or do you have to be able to pass a rhetoric test in order to learn to write? This is something that's actually sort of near and dear to me because I'm somewhat dyslexic. And I'm a terrible speller, and it wasn't until I got freed of teachers of rhetoric that I could actually teach myself to write. So I hear the foundational part, and I also hear the foundational part in terms of sort of the cognitive and cultural hammock. It's important that we know some stuff. And that we put it into long-term memory. And so some of these old-fashioned things like memorizing the names of the presidents and Civil War battlefields and some of that kind of stuff may actually be more important than we think. The question is, to me, really the scheduling. How do we get that train going along with this other train and the people who have redone Bloom's taxonomy have started have started to move the arrows around a little bit in terms of the sequencing, and have tended to favor doing things at earlier stages in the list. That's an internally contradictory answer, but I'm standing on it, you know. It's the best I could do. Yes, please.
There's another piece of this that I would like to bring in. My background is, for about a year, I acted as a consultant when the National Education Technology Plan was being written.
Mm-hmm.
At the same time that the FCC was writing a new broadband plan for the country, and I worked on both of those. And this question came up in both of those.
Mm-hmm.
One part of it is, some kids develop those competencies early, and in the seat time system, they have to sit there and hear what they already know rather than accelerating. They're waiting for the slower kids in the class. So the merit badges sort of, makes it sound like something other than just demonstrating basic competency so that you're ready to go beyond that at a time before your classmates are ready. Conversely, some kids are a little slower to pick up the same concepts, but they're pushed along at the same rate. So part of this is letting kids find their own rate of demonstrating competencies, not the merit badge so much as developing and demonstrating that they have mastered certain competencies. So that was a part of the conversation a couple of years ago.
So let me play that back a little bit, because there's important stuff here. We have tended to think about the merit badges as this sort of end of course or end of experience thing. This sort of Mr. Goodwrench or Eagle Scout kinds of things. And what I'm hearing in your comment is a plea to move this into instruction itself, and to build pieces of instruction, hence my Legos, that are about getting little competencies, so that those can be hunked together into meaningful experiences that might be big competencies. Am I getting close? Okay.
And not to peg it to the age of the child.
Right.
Or the number of hours that they've been sitting in a
Right.
particular class.
Right. Yeah. That we may want to rethink age appropriate. Yeah. Okay.
In the far back there?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's you.
Okay, I was not gonna ask this before, but I will now. Is the age appropriate question is also about the socialization of children. Because I know there are I come from a family of 6, and there were 3 of us who were gonna be promoted or sent to a higher grade, a grade ahead of us. For us, those kids seemed so much older, so much more intimidating. We weren't ready for it socially, even if we were ready for it intellectually. So the grade or the age thing, that's a real interesting thing to look at. Does it have to be age or grade appropriate? There's also the socialization part of it too.
Yeah, I wouldn't disagree. Yeah. It's amazing what young kids can do within the company of young kids. One of the schools I fell in love with was High Tech High down in San Diego. They make an art out of getting people to fall in love with the schools. But one of the things they did, they got this little elementary school. They had elementary kids doing city planning.
Yeah.
And I thought, this is cool. These are all elementary kids. They bring the socialization of elementary kids into this. But over the course of a semester, they could start to think about, how much stuff costs, spatial relationships, how to measure things, and so forth and so on. And at the end, they actually build a model city, and this kid is explaining his model city, and he says at the end, yes, and my house is right next to Jennifer's.
But you said early in the talk that we've bundled a number of different activities into a single institution.
Yeah, the teaching, testing, and growing up.
Teaching, testing,
yeah.
and growing up.
Yeah.
And the growing up piece is non-trivial, right? We expect schools to manage that process as well as the teaching and testing.
Right.
But that complicates then the other two, right?
Yeah.
Is
Yeah.
that the teaching and testing are then fully enmeshed with the fact that children are growing up in this place as well. And,
Yeah.
and that's the problem that we face.
Yeah, I mean, in an ideal world, you'd say something like, let's group students who can actually learn well together. We know they're big tails, both end of the sort of cognitive curve, and at any given day, a third of the kids are terrified and a third are bored. And we could probably do something, something good or better with both of those thirds. I see a hand that just really got to go up here.
No, I was just gonna circle back to the question of the merit badge and the assumptions that we had over time about end-of-course assessment. Because it's really different to have the assumption that I have an assessment that I believe measures the core content of a subject that I know the child has sat through, versus I have an assessment that the child's never sat through, a course, and is gonna try to take a test to demonstrate competency. That's a very different kind of assessment.
You bet, that's an important statement, that's a very important statement. And we're gonna have to get better at creating those, in order to do any of this, we're gonna have to get better at creating those kinds of assessments. There is some history. I mean, if you want to take it, if you want to do the literality of it, we had a system, of merit badge counselors that would work with young women and young men on these programs of instruction. And what was interesting there was it was a kind of blended learning. It wasn't just somebody walking into the room and logging into a computer and taking an exam. There was a certain face-to-face relationship that was harder to fake in that. And so the nature of the exam may turn out to be different than most of our policy friends are thinking.
And if I can, I just want to follow up on drawing the thread back to the question of technology.
Yes.
Where all this started. And the issue of, so not only is seat time versus, something else, that it's asynchronous, that it's becoming asynchronous. That we've got kids who learn online, we've got kids who go through homeschooling, and even though they meet with the teacher who's credentialed, whatever, but they're no longer, the whole question of this structure that you're talking about is the capacity for the system to manage asynchronous learning.
Right, I think that's very well spoken, and the next time I give that talk, that line will be in there.
You can send me a check then.
Yeah, that's right, yeah, well, David pays so well, I can take care of him. I think that's a really interesting piece, because all the places I have visited, this quality of being asynchronous has crept into the learning, and it makes we're not just talking about Kava schools here. We're talking about regular public school classrooms. I use the high school that's 2 blocks from my house as one of the places that I visited, and the high school was actually turned around by one teacher who went out and she spent $50 and got the license, or she got the license for free, but she paid $50 out of her own pocket for the web hosting, and got Moodle installed for Classroom. And the first year it was her, and the next year it was her and 2 other teachers, and then the adoption curve went vertical. It just the way Clay Christensen would predict. And they've got 450 courses at Claremont High, and 4,500 students. And if you're not on Moodle now, the parents will call up and say, how come I can't get my kid's assignment? And so you got some really, really sort of interesting demand push. But the things that these teachers told me was that their teacher day was really different than their teacher day was before. One is there started to be expectations about when do you actually respond to me? Are you required to respond to me when you're on vacation on the beach in July? What's the etiquette there? How long should an email or a message sit before you respond? This is very important stuff. The other thing was the asynchronicity of lectures. They figured out flipped classroom pretty fast. And as a result, the classroom time that I saw was very, very rich in terms of its discussion, as opposed to the singularity of lecturing. So that was really interesting. And I thought, this all occurred because one teacher decided to do something. There was no mandate. There was no money. It just kind of happened. And I want us to be able to take advantage of the instinct toward peer production, joining together with other people to make things happen, and to create value and to create interest in equity in the society. So yes, asynchronicity is extremely important.
Yep, all the way down.
I'm a huge fan of bringing in all of the technology into classrooms and seeing that it's changed kids' lives. I think that there's some really important questions that need to constantly be asked, because too often when I've actually gone into the schools, it's been used as credit recovery. You walk in the room and there's 60 kids sitting in front of a computer,
Right.
maybe sort of engaged and just pushing
Right,
buttons
right,
so that they
right.
can get their credit. You ask 3 questions and there's no understanding of the whole system. So if they're doing history, they might be able to say George Washington was the first president and John Kennedy was, the youngest, whatever. But when you go to have any kind of conversation, pretty difficult. So you can't take that out of the context, I don't think, of having some kind of a group interaction, from my way of thinking, preferably in person, but or online, where there's a discussion aspect of it and placing those what you're learning into the context of civic life or your own life or social discourse.
If there's a question in there, that's fine. The statement is, I want to say I'm amen to that. There is enormous amounts, issues with how we have used technology for credit recovery. Some of it borders on fraud. A lot of it goes over the borders of opportunism. And that's one of the reasons that I don't find myself entirely seated on the deregulation bus. Sort of anything, we do have a responsibility as a state not to say anything goes. And therefore we need to watch this stuff as it unfolds. You and I probably both know that there is a race and class dimension to who gets credit recovery and who gets real instruction. I spent some years ago, I was in doing a little project for a foundation, and I was tramping through a high school in South Carolina. And I sort of knew where I was, and I went into this high school and I didn't see anything but white people. And I thought, well, this is strange, because I kind of know what the demographics of this area look like. Until I went down the hall, at the end of the hall, in this massive room that used to be a study hall and was now outfitted with computers, and I go in, and there must have been 150 black faces all staring at a CRT. those were the kids that were getting the drill and kill stuff, while the other kids got real instruction. I mean, we need to not forget what we learned, when we were fighting this set of equity battles over our lifetime. At the same time, there are lots of things that technology ought to be able to do for remediation before you get to the point of having to do credit recovery. The problem is not to do credit recovery, the problem is to do credit. To find enough supports that are along the way so that more kids don't have to end up into, by the time you're into credit recovery, most of these kids are out to game the system. They've been told they're dumb long enough that their only game left is a game, because they're not going to get the approval of their teachers. That's already been shown.
Actually, I've talked to kids in credit recovery who are so proud of what they've attained and so proud of their work, and they, show that they're gonna graduate from high school, they're gonna get that diploma, and their mom didn't think that they could. So
Interesting.
I actually kind of have a slightly different experience
Yeah,
there.
that's interesting.
And now, I
Yeah.
don't know if you're familiar with SciTech. But
Yeah.
SciTech is a charter school in San Diego that is also located on Treasure Island. There's one here in Sacramento, and the charter's out of San Diego, so I think it kind of is a little off of your contiguous county rule. But it also involves.
Oh, there's a different rule for charters.
They live on their they live at the school
That's why they have
and
multiple
combine it
sites.
with career education.
Right.
So,
Right.
and they've been wonderful, the ones that Lisa and I visited.
Yeah. Let me first of all, to do the geography business. A charter school can get a charter in different counties. That's allowable. And then they can do stuff in counties around that county. And so the notion that you've got a school that's in San Diego that's also in the Bay Area just meant that they got more
Based
than
on
one charter.
one charter in San Diego.
Did they get a statewide charter? Oh, okay, they got a statewide charter. There's such a thing as a statewide charter. Yep.
The term would be that it's
Okay.
one charter, but different sites.
So Chuck,
Okay.
that actually leads to the question I was gonna ask, which is that when you talked about the low-hanging fruit,
Yeah,
you focused on the special education piece, but you mentioned three others.
well,
And I wonder if
special,
you wanted to talk a little bit more about
Sure.
English language learners and about remediation, because I think that links
yeah,
to
well,
this
let me go
discussion.
back, let me see what, I don't know, what's in here someplace.
There you are.
The English language learners, special ed, and remediation have some common aspects to them. They're organizationally different. Special ed is different in part because it is a protected category in terms of the students who get assigned to special ed and the conditions under which they are assigned. But the underlying pedagogy, which we're really thankful for the special education folks for bringing to us, is one of intense individualization. And English language learning has a protocol about it, which in some respects is about intense individualization. And remediation is essentially about intense individualization. And the sort of leap that I made was there's an awful lot in our ability to put together learning modules and adaptive software that might address all three of these problems, albeit somewhat differently.
When I think about the issues around English language learners and special ed kids, some of it is about the kinds of instruction that they get, but a lot of it is about the interpersonal relationships.
Right.
The English language learners need to hear a lot of English, they need to be communicating in English. Special ed kids often need a lot of social reinforcement and learning about how to follow the kinds of rules that we set up
Right.
in schools and in the workforce. And I'm just, a lot of this conversation has made me think about what the structures are on the
Right.
ground that, you know, how much computer time are we talking compared to the kinds of groupings that I think a lot of us would agree are important.
One of the problems that I don't have a 2/3, 1/3, so forth, answer. One of the things that I've noticed when I go into classrooms, particularly for early elementary classrooms where you get the majority of the English language learners in first, second, third, fourth grade, is that for the kids who are struggling, it's almost impossible for the teacher to figure out whether the child is learning disabled or whether they're just having more trouble than most kids at trying to make the transition into English. That's an almost impossible task to ask anybody to do. The testing and measurements, people are not very good at it, and so forth and so on. And so I guess my plea would be find enough stuff that you can put in that teacher's hands so that he or she can make an on-the-spot diagnosis without going through the enormous formalities that are involved in trying to get somebody legally enrolled and engrossed in special education with all the accounting and all that sort of. I mean, we've created a very difficult, on purpose, adversarial system there, because it was assumed that the parents and kids would enforce the rules. And I just want to get teachers more stuff they can use, better diagnostics, better tools, and let them figure out, what the balance is and how much of this stuff, particularly if you've got the asynchronous qualities of learning, how much of this stuff can go home. One of my students studies how Latino kids use technology. They got a lot of these. There are a lot of these out in the community. If it's a supply equity problem in getting these to people, we know how to do this. It's it's cheap and it's easy. And so if you got learning tools that are on this thing, and you can take it home with you, it doesn't make any difference whether your house or your apartment has broadband, because you're not only carrying the machine with you, you're carrying your network with you.
Hi, I chair the commission on special ed, so this is a
Yay!
very
Okay, we have actual expertise in the room. Elvis will leave now.
I have a daughter who's 14 who uses assistive technology to communicate. She's nonverbal and has severe cognitive challenges, and she's in an inclusion situation in a typical 7th grade classroom in a school setting where.
But she uses one of these to communicate.
She uses an iPad,
Yep.
Pearl Quotago,
Yep.
which we've seen like on 60 Minutes and stuff. So, but what I like is that the teachers are spending less time on actually laminating and making picture cards and modifying books, and more time actually instructing her. And so if there's a huge benefit just in terms of time and some of the stuff that you talked about is how the time is spent. And so I think for special educators, the time is able to be spent on more productive things of actually working with the student, as opposed to the 6 or 8 hours that I've heard them in the past say that they used to actually modify one story for one lesson during 1 week. And so, and the second piece that I wanted to ask you what you thought of was around teacher preparation and the disconnect between teachers that are currently in preparation programs and out in student teaching positions that we're so on the cusp with so much of, especially around special ed with technology, that the classrooms that they're in don't have technology or the teachers that have that expertise. So we have a whole group of new upcoming student teachers who are very tech savvy, who are going into situations that are not and don't have an infrastructure of technology. And so what is the responsibility of our teacher preparation programs to ensure that our new teachers are in placements that actually are able to build in those skills? Because right now, there's kind of a lack of those things. And so California, we're at the bottom, like you said, in least restrictive environment, in achievement for special ed, and all these things. However, we still have we have a lot of classrooms that are very restrictive, that are not using a lot of the same things that maybe they should be. So at some point, where's that balance gonna be? You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, I hear the question. I'm waiting for your answer. Because you obviously know more about this than I do. Where would you start? I mean, here you've got a situation where we've got teachers who are smarter than the schools in which they're going, right? They know more about how to use the technology and so forth. Now, this is not an unusual situation, and historically what happens is those teachers get socialized, which is to say they get dumbed down. Somebody comes to them and says, all that fancy highfalutin stuff they taught you down at the university, so I'm going to tell you how it really works here. And what I hear you saying is we don't want that to happen. So how can we give enough agency to teachers that they can do what they know how to do, using a new set of tools? Have you got some policy ideas you can help us with? Yeah. Well, come talk to Chuck. Well, I will write them down. That's what I get paid for.
I just want to, why wouldn't you do that virtually, in part? And I also have to say, on behalf of experienced teachers, there are many teachers who have a lot to offer. They may not know a lot about technology, but they have other things that are really important and that they know about, and they're not necessarily, saying, this is how we do it here, and that's a bad way. So I just kind of wanted to make a little shout out for the experienced teachers.
The experienced teacher I sleep with will appreciate that.
You can tell it from me.
Yes, Jim?
Professor, there's a lot of discussion on blended learning for our students.
Yeah.
The same argument for professional development, looking at the budget and Prop 30 is passed, that school districts are still struggling financially. And what is your research shown for blended learning for school districts when it comes to how do we look at this at a large scale? We might have pilots at a few schools, but they say we're at the cusp now, we want to take it large scale, but
Right.
the infrastructure for PD is huge. I think that really permeates with the number of districts.
I'm going to give you a disappointing answer. I've not studied continuing education. I know that there is a ton of it out there, and that the march of webinars and other sorts of blended learning opportunities is increasing rapidly. Do you have a sense about it? How would you approach this?
I do. Well, no, I've talked in my new job with a number of school districts, and they're all taking different approaches. And of course, that's great because it's not a one-size-fits-all. But some of them are just looking at the cost benefit and how do we give, I applaud them because they're saying we want to be thoughtful, we want to respond to teachers, we want to give them the best training so that they look at this as a tool, not just for the kids, but for them as teachers to help them with their days. But how do we do that? We know teachers learn at different levels. I might learn one assignment better than you, and you might really get something the next day, and I have to listen to it 2 or 3 times. So they want to honor that, but districts are just having different approaches. So I can give you a list of maybe 5 to 6 schools that are approaching it, but at the very surface level, because it's coming so quickly. They're thinking of Common Core, they're thinking of how to address, they're out of compliance hypothetically for special ed, and want to be responsive, but they're at a surface level, and so it's an exciting time, but they're really pulling.
Right. Well, this is one of the situations, and you're going to find this anytime you have a system that's in flux. You're going to find practice is going to lead what the academy thinks it knows by 5 to 10 years. That is, the interesting stuff when you get down to applied educational technology, is going to be in the applied part. And therefore, it's important for people who call themselves researchers to get out and watch what people are actually doing. Because there's lots of really good, what we would call natural experiments going on. It's also important for people who are practitioners to be a little thoughtful about it. And that's a problem, because days get filled up with calendars and meetings and so forth. And the famous admonition for administrators is, I don't want it right, I want it Tuesday. But it's important to treat within a school district, within a labor contract, these experiences as being little experiments. Okay, we tried this. Well, some of the teachers didn't like it. Oh, well, let's not do it anymore. Oh, but what about the other teachers? So we start to get actual information in the system so that going to school actually makes you smarter. And that's sort of a Pollyanna answer, but it's the best I can do on a Friday.
Yeah, okay, in the middle there, one last question.
There's a movement for computer adaptive and computer-based testing, and for English language.
I'm sorry, yeah, I'm not getting you, okay.
Sorry.
I got there's a movement.
So there's a movement for computer adaptive testing and computer-based testing, and for English language learners, the requirement to assess them in their listening and speaking skills is there in terms of we need to assess those skills. But then we have cell phones where you can do speech to text, and if I say call mom, it goes to calling Bob instead. So the question of accuracy, technology, have you seen, or is there any research, or have you seen other functionalities in the role of technology that can accurately measure speaking or other kinds of skills that are more orally based?
That's a good question. You're out of my zone of expertise.
I only know this. I know that when you talk about the English language in general, that's much more difficult. When the software programs have a limited vocabulary, and the children have to respond to that vocabulary, the accuracy of the voice to text goes up remarkably. So that's the real issue: is do you have the vocabulary in the software? Is my understanding.
And also
Right.
the question of accent. Can it
Yeah.
decipher through the accent and figure out if you truly are saying the correct word in English, even though there's an accent to it?
I
Yeah.
can, so I don't know why the.
Yeah, right. Yeah, I'm from Chicago. I don't have no accent.
All right, well, I want to thank you all for
Yeah.
coming, and particularly thank Chuck for
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, enjoy it.
a very thought-provoking presentation, and I think there are plenty of questions that will carry well beyond today's seminar. So thank you all.
Thank you.